Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our in-flight MDM service, Problems Addressed Interactive Q&A Activity webinar. My name is Ashley DeCoto, and I am a specialist with our provider outreach and education team. On the call with me today is my friend and colleague, Leanne Foster, who will be helping out with the chat. This webinar is part 2 of our 2-part series on the problem element of medical decision-making for evaluation and management services. Yesterday, Leanne held the part 1 webinar, which provided a more comprehensive overview on the problem element. Now, if you were not able to attend her session yesterday, that recording will be available within the next week or so in the training center of our website and on our YouTube channel. We will also have a recording of this session available in the training center on our website, and Leanne will be adding a link for that training center to the chat. It will be available on our website for the next 60 to 90 days, barring any technical issues with the recording. And you can access this without having to access YouTube, as we do recognize that not everyone is able to access YouTube from work. The recording will also be available on our YouTube channel, and it will stay there as long as this information remains relevant and current. Also in our training center, you can find a copy of today's presentation. So if you haven't already grabbed that, it is still available for download in case you'd like to have the presentation to follow along or maybe to take notes, though it's not required. We are taking questions through the chat today, which again, Leanne will be monitoring. I will check in with Leanne at the end of the presentation, time permitting, for any unanswered questions in the chat. We did have some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, and I will be answering those that relate to problems addressed throughout the presentation today. Now, if we do not get to live chat questions, we will answer those in a follow-up email. All right, for our agenda, we'll start out by doing a brief recap from Leanne's part 1 webinar yesterday. After that part 1 recap, most of our session will be the interactive Q&A activity. And lastly, we will share a few resources. This 2-part series is meant to focus specifically on the problem element of medical decision-making. While we will be talking about the problem element today, Leanne and I have 2 additional series scheduled in the next couple of months, one for data and one for the risk element. We did have a handful of questions regarding the data and risk element of medical decision-making, which we're not covering today, but registration is open for the data series on our live events page, and then registration should be open for our risk series in the next few weeks. And if you're not able to attend those, like with most of our webinars, we do plan to post recordings of those series, barring any technical issues, of course. Okay, let's start with a recap of Leanne's session from yesterday. So when choosing your code for most evaluation and management services, you can use either the time spent for that encounter or medical decision-making. When using medical decision-making, or MDM, to choose your level of service, you will need to consider 3 elements. So the first element is the number and complexity of problems addressed during the encounter, which is our primary focus today. The second element of medical decision-making is the amount and complexity of data reviewed for the encounter, which we will dig deeper into during that series next month. And then the third element is the risk of complications and/or morbidity or mortality of patient management. And again, our series on the data element will be held in August. So most E&M services have 4 levels of service, which are straightforward, low, moderate, and high, or some just have 3 levels where straightforward and low are combined into one code. You'll select your level of service based on meeting or exceeding the requirements of that level for 2 out of the 3 elements. So for example, if you have, let's say, a moderate level of problem, a moderate level of risk, and a low level of data, you can select a moderate level of service because you met that for 2 elements. Another thing that becomes really important in medical decision making is using the CPT definitions for each element. And these are outlined in the CPT book and also in a CPT resource that Leanne will be putting in the chat for our activity in a few slides. There are definitions for the types of problems, the components of the data element, and for the examples of risk. Now let's look a little bit closer at what the problem element of medical decision making includes. So the CPT book defines a problem as a disease, condition, illness, injury, symptom, sign, finding, complaint, or other matter addressed at the encounter, with or without a diagnosis being established at the time of the encounter. So what's important to keep in mind with the problem element is that you're only accounting for problems that were addressed or considered when making treatment decisions for that encounter. So even though some or many of your Medicare beneficiaries may have a long list of problems in their history, you're only counting those that were evaluated or treated during the encounter. So if Bob goes to see Dr. Smith for a rash on his elbow, but also has diabetes, asthma, and hypertension, you would not count the diabetes, asthma, and hypertension for medical decision making unless they are addressed during the encounter. So if the documentation only shows that, let's say Dr. Smith recommended steroid cream, the rash is all you would count. But if the documentation shows how Dr. Smith had to take into account Bob's diabetes in determining the treatment plan, then you would also be able to count the diabetes because it was used in making treatment decisions. So we've included this slide here to show what errors have been found that relate to selecting level of service. 2 of the top CERT errors for office visits are listed here. The first error listed here, you may have seen before, which is the error for documentation supporting a lower level of E&M. So make sure that your documentation supports the level of service billed. Remember, for the problem element, just having the problem listed in the history is not sufficient documentation to count it for MDM. The second bullet point here may come as a surprise to some, which is the error for documentation supporting a higher level of E&M. And the point we want to make here is do not sell yourself short for work that was done. So if a problem was maybe not the original reason for the visit, but was evaluated in making treatment decisions, make sure that you're counting that if the documentation supports it. We have included 2 links here. The first is to a page on our WPS website with more information on E&M CERT errors. The second link takes you to the CMS website where you can find a list of CERT reports. And the 2025 CERT report was released on January 24th of this year, and that's where you'll find these E&M errors. So before we move into our activity, I wanted to share a quote here that Leanne and I really like by Sir William Osler. It is much more important to know what sort of a patient has a disease than what sort of a disease a patient has. And this is a concept that's really important to keep in mind with medical decision making, especially when it comes to the problem element. We have a lot of pre-submitted questions asking which problem level this condition is, or asking if this is a chronic problem. The medical decision-making will depend on what occurred and what was documented for that encounter. There's not a blanket list of conditions for each problem level, unfortunately. So, for example, a sinus infection might not be a big deal for one patient, but might be severe or chronic for another patient. It's important to look at the full picture and the documentation rather than a list of diseases or conditions that the patient has. All right, now we're going to shift gears into our interactive Q&A activity. And we've designed this to be kind of a fun way to test your knowledge. So we'll be launching a poll for each question. And even if you aren't 100% sure on the correct answer, that's okay. We'd love for you to participate and give it your best shot. I'll give you a moment to lock in your answers, and then I'll walk through the correct answer for each question. Now, for those of you who have attended our Q&A activity webinars like this one in the past, I do want to make note of a slight difference that you might see today. Due to some technical issues we're having this week with our webinar software, you may need to click an icon that will have a plus sign. It should be next to the chat icon towards the lower right portion of your screen, and it will say Show Apps if you hover over it. And then once you click that, it should allow for you to click on Slido, or Slido, not sure how they say it, which is the platform that we'll be using for the poll questions today. So I'm going to take a quick sip of water and give everyone a chance to find that portion. All right, before I launch our first poll question, we did have some pre-submitted questions that were asking for resources. And this slide has resources for our activity today. And Leanne will also be placing these links in the chat in case you haven't downloaded the presentation. And you're welcome to have these open to help out with our activity. The last resource listed here is one that I find particularly helpful, and I may even refer to that one throughout our activity. We also had a pre-submitted question asking what the Medicare requirements are for E&M codes. So Medicare does follow CPT guidelines for medical decision making. So I really encourage you to use either your CPT book, if you have that available to you, or again, the last link on this slide and in the chat, which provides the same information for MDE, or MDM, excuse me. And you'll find that starting on the bottom of page 6 when you click on this link for the CPT E&M guidelines. Okay. So for our first question, there is no right or wrong answer for this one. We just want to get a feel for what our attendees think about the MDM elements. So the question is, which element of MDM do you personally find most challenging? You can select A for problem, B for data, C for risk, or D if you don't know, or if all of them are challenging. We'll give everyone just a moment to make sure you found the polling questions and to get your answer locked in. All right, it looks like just about everyone has their answers in. We're kind of split across the three, but the majority rules, 58% of you say the risk element. So for those of you who selected the problem element, we do hope that this series will help some with that challenge. For those who selected data or risk, make sure that you sign up for our upcoming series for those two elements in July and August. I again want to point out, I know a lot of you selected risk, and that doesn't surprise us, and we'll be doing the risk element in August. Okay. So for our first real question, if documentation supports a low level of problem, low level of data, and moderate risk, which level of service is appropriate using MDM? Is it straightforward, low, moderate, or high? All right, it looks like most of you have your answers in and most got this one right. We like to start out a little bit on the easier side. The answer to this one is B, low. You've met or exceeded two elements in the low level. So even though you have moderate risk, two of your three elements, problem and data, are at a low level. So you would choose the low level code in this scenario. All right, our next question. So our next question is, which of these are part of the problem element by definition? You can select all that apply from these options. So we have A, disease, B, illness, C, injury, or D, symptom. We'll give it just another moment. About half of you, I think, have your answers in. Okay, the answer is all of these. So if you downloaded the presentation, you probably see the definition in the notes section as a true or false question, which is how we had originally planned to ask this question. Anyway, if you haven't downloaded the presentation, CPT defines problem as I mentioned earlier in our part 1 review. It's a disease, condition, illness, injury, symptom, sign, finding, complaint, or other matter addressed at the encounter, again, with or without a diagnosis being established at the time of the encounter. So this is whatever the practitioner is treating or evaluating during that encounter. You may not have a diagnosis yet, but the patient comes in with certain symptoms or complaints. Those symptoms that are evaluated or treated are the problems addressed for this element of medical decision-making. All right, let's move on to our next question. I apologize with the delay between questions. We're kind of getting used to using Slido. Okay, our next question is, conditions that the patient has but are not addressed during the encounter are counted towards MDM. True or false? All right, the answer to this one is false. And this is in line with what I mentioned on the last slide and during our part 1 review. The problem element of medical decision-making includes only those evaluated or treated during that encounter. So if it's just listed in the history, but not addressed, you would not count that towards medical decision-making. Now, you may have situations where you can consider a problem as addressed if the documentation shows consideration of that problem in order to deal with the problem that has caused the encounter. Let's give an example of that. Let's say the patient comes in for pain in the knee. In consideration of the treatment, your physician is also addressing and analyzing the diabetes for consideration of whether or not to give the patient a steroid. So there are considerations such as, is the steroid injection going to affect the diabetes? Or is the diabetes going to affect the steroid injection? So long as the documentation shows that the diabetes was considered during that encounter, it can be counted for the problem element in medical decision making. Or another example could be a patient who presents with a sinus infection, but also has hypertension. The physician may be considering the hypertension in determining the treatment plan because decongestants can raise blood pressure. So if it's just listed in the documentation, but is not addressed, you would not count that towards your level of problem. If it is addressed, like in our example with the knee pain and diabetes, or the sinus infection and hypertension, you can count it. One more thing on this slide, you may also have statements that the problem is being managed by somebody else, maybe a specialist, for example. You would not count that as part of your problem addressed unless your physician or practitioner is also evaluating and managing that, or that comes into play with what they are addressing during that encounter. Okay. Our next question is, a statement in the medical record saying all chronic problems addressed is sufficient alone to show level of problem. True or false? All right, the answer for this one is false. This type of statement is not sufficient for problems addressed. The documentation should show which problems were addressed and how they were addressed. Again, just because a condition is listed in that patient's history does not mean it counts for medical decision making. The documentation must show how that problem was addressed or evaluated to count it under the problem element of medical decision making. We had a question which asked for best documentation recommendations for determining chronic versus acute conditions. So there's a few things to consider here. One is something I just mentioned, which is making sure that it was actually addressed during the encounter. So for example, if you have a patient with diabetes who comes in because they have the sniffles and the diabetes is not addressed at all, you would not count that. You would just count the sinus infection. Now, in determining whether you have a chronic versus an acute condition, you'll want to double check against the CPT definitions. The biggest thing to keep in mind as far as the difference goes is the amount of time the patient has had or will have that condition. A chronic condition is one that has lasted or is expected to last at least 12 months. We've had many questions in the past asking for a list of all chronic conditions. While there's not an all-inclusive list, CMS does list some examples of chronic conditions in an MLN on chronic care management, which you can find by going out to cms.gov and searching for chronic care management. But again, there are some examples of conditions that are inherently chronic. But remember the quote that we looked at just before this activity. It is much more important to know what sort of a patient has a disease than what sort of a disease a patient has. So you may have a patient with a condition that is chronic for them, but might not be chronic for me. For example, I hurt my back a few weeks ago lifting some heavy boxes for a garage sale. My problem was acute because that pain only lasted me a few days, and we had no reason to believe it would last more than a year. But a friend of mine has degenerative disc disease and has dealt with lower back pain for a number of years. If she sees her doctor today for back pain, well, we have a chronic problem because it's lasted her for more than a year. So your acute conditions are shorter term. Chronic means it's lasted or it's expected to last at least a year. While some conditions might be inherently chronic, there are some that are not, like my back pain example. And this is where it becomes really important for the documentation to paint the picture of that problem. All right, for our next question, which of the following is a problem in the differential diagnosis that represents a condition likely to result in a high risk of morbidity without treatment? Is it stable acute illness, chronic illness with exacerbation, self-limited or minor problem, or undiagnosed new problem with uncertain prognosis? And give it just another moment. All right, it looks like our answers were kind of split down the middle between B and D on this one. The correct answer is D, undiagnosed new problem with uncertain prognosis, which is a moderate problem level. So there's a couple things we wanted to point out with this question. One is, again, those definitions in the CPT book. If you're newer or maybe don't have access to the CPT book yet, those definitions are also found in that AMA resource, which was the last of the links in the chat for this activity, and then also listed, excuse me, on the activity resources slide, which is slide 9. The other thing we want to point out here is that there will be those situations where you don't yet have a diagnosis. Maybe the patient comes in with a lump in their breast, but we don't know what it is yet. It meets this definition because we don't have a diagnosis and the prognosis is uncertain without further treatment and testing, and the symptoms and signs represent a condition likely to have a high risk of morbidity. We had a pre-submitted question which asked, what is the criteria for an undiagnosed new problem when a PCP refers a patient to a specialist with an unspecified diagnosis? So the documentation would need to show how the PCP evaluated this new problem. If the documentation just shows referral to a specialist, that would not be enough. I had a situation last year where I went to my doctor with a new problem of joint pain. So if my doctor had just documented that she referred me to a rheumatologist, that would not be enough to count as an undiagnosed new problem with uncertain prognosis. She would need to document her thought process and how she evaluated my joint pain in order to count this as an undiagnosed new problem with uncertain prognosis. Did she observe any swelling or evaluate for a possible sprain? Did she order any tests before referring me to the rheumatologist? Did she suspect arthritis or some type of autoimmune condition? What are my risks without treatment for this new problem? All of those things would need to be documented. All right, the next question. Oh, hang on just a minute. There we go. The next question is, which of the following describes a chronic illness? And I think most of you are going to get this one right. You can select all but apply from A, has lasted at least 1 year, B, expected to last at least 1 year, C, expected to last until the death of the patient, or D, short-term problem. All right, everyone got those answers in super quick, and I think we all know the answer is A, B, and C. So again, a chronic problem has lasted or is expected to last at least 1 year or until the death of the patient. If the documentation does not support that this requirement is met, then you probably don't have a chronic problem. You might have a minor or an acute problem if it's more short term and not expected to last at least a year. Okay, our next question is, headaches are always considered a self-limited or minor problem. True or false? All right, answer for this one is false. There, of course, are situations where a headache is a minor or self-limited problem. I had a headache yesterday that would not go away until I shut my computer down and went outside for some fresh air. My headache went away when I wasn't staring at my computer screen. But maybe you have a patient with cluster headaches, a problem they've struggled with for years. Today they come in stating the medication is no longer working and they're waking up nightly with stabbing pain. This could be a chronic illness with exacerbation, as long as the documentation supports it. Or if maybe the medication has been working, you might have a stable chronic illness. Again, the documentation would need to support that problem level. Or another example could be a sinus infection. For an otherwise healthy patient, a sinus infection is usually a minor or a self-limited problem. But for a patient with COPD, that sinus infection is more severe. So again, just listing that diagnosis does not give enough information to determine the problem level. We need to see the complexity of the problems addressed. We had a pre-submitted question asking, what problem category does a win? So this is going to depend on the documentation and the type of fracture. Not all fractures will be classified the same way. For example, maybe you have an undisplaced toe fracture, which was buddy taped, and instructions were given to rest and ice the injury. Well, you probably have an acute, uncomplicated injury, which is a low problem level. But let's say you have another patient with that same type of injury, but this patient has peripheral neuropathy. The physician has documented that the fracture carries a higher risk of delayed healing and infection. Well, that complicates the injury, and now we have an acute complicated injury. Or you could have a patient who severely fractured their ankle, let's say 2 years ago, but continues to have pain. And the physician has determined that this patient now has post-traumatic arthritis as a result of that fracture. Well, we now have a chronic problem because the duration is more than 1 year. So it won't be one size fits all. The problem level will depend on what the documentation supports for the fracture. Okay. Our next question is a scenario. Dr. Joe treats Robin for diabetes, hypertension, and asthma during an E&M visit. This is automatically a high problem level because Robin has so many chronic conditions. True or false? All right. Excuse me, I have a little tickle. The answer to this one is false. So the point we want to make is that stacking the conditions does not give you a higher problem level. And by stacking, I mean having multiple problems of the same severity. So if you're treating 2 stable chronic illnesses, that falls under the moderate level for problems addressed. But if you're treating 3 stable chronic illnesses, does that increase the problem level? No, it does not. 2 or more stable chronic illnesses are moderate. So whether you're treating 2 stable chronic illnesses, or maybe you're treating 7 stable chronic illnesses, it's still a moderate problem level. Now, that's not to say that you might not have a higher level of risk in those situations, but the problem level is still moderate. All right, our next question. I am really having a hard time getting these to launch. There we go. All right, our next question is, a problem that is normally self-limited or minor, but not resolving with a definite and prescribed course, is an acute, uncomplicated illness or injury. True or false? We'll give it just another moment or so. I think a few are still thinking about it. All right, we're kind of split down the middle on this one. The answer for this one is true. So maybe a patient has had a rash, something that is normally a minor problem. The rash is not resolving as expected with over-the-counter hydrocortisone. So the physician has evaluated and orders a stronger topical steroid. There's little to no risk of mortality with treatment, and we have an acute, uncomplicated illness or injury. All right, for the next question. Here we go. Okay, I think my hand wants to move faster than the webinar does. So for this question, Dr. Joe sees Robin today for a diabetes follow-up and notes that she sees Dr. Bob for treatment of her depression. The depression counts for the problem element of MDM for this visit. True or false? All right, the answer here is false. Dr. Joe would not count depression in medical decision making if the only note of the depression is that she sees another doctor for it. There's no documentation in that case of the depression being treated or evaluated by Dr. Joe, just a note that it is treated by another physician. All right, we have a few more questions left. Our next question is, documentation shows Betty is making improvements to her diabetes with daily metformin. Today's blood test shows A1C level of 8.5%. The treatment goal is to keep her under 7%. Betty has a stable chronic illness. True or false? All right, the answer to this one is false. So a chronic illness, again, we know that is one that's lasted or is expected to last at least 1 year or until the death of the patient. And some conditions are inherently chronic, like diabetes, as it usually, not always, but usually lasts the rest of the patient's life. But for a stable chronic illness, the patient must be at treatment goals for that condition. And this is based on specific goals set by the practitioner in their treatment of that condition. So in Betty's case, her physician wants her A1C below 7%. Betty's test today shows that she is not currently meeting treatment goals, so this would not be a stable chronic illness. She may have a chronic illness with exacerbation or progression if the documentation supports it in this scenario. Okay. Our next question is, which of the following describes an injury requiring treatment, which includes evaluation of body systems that are not directly part of the injured organ? Is it A, acute uncomplicated injury, B, acute complicated injury, C, minimal problem, or D, chronic illness with exacerbation? All right, the answer for this one is B. We had a pre-submitted question which asked for an explanation of what a complicated injury is. So according to the CPT definition, an acute complicated injury requires treatment, including evaluating body systems that are not directly part of that injury. An example of this could be a patient presenting for laceration of their scalp And based on information from the patient, the practitioner also performs a neurological exam. Or I've also given the example of someone like my husband who's always injuring himself with power tools and presents with a superficial burn on their finger from a frayed live wire. Even though the visible damage is minimal, an electrical current traveled through the body and the practitioner must perform a cardiac evaluation. So the complication is that while the presenting problem is the electrical burn on the hand, further evaluation is needed due to the potential effects on the cardiovascular system. All right. All right, our next question is, which of the following are true for an acute illness with systemic symptoms? Is it A, has high risk of morbidity without treatment? B, little to no risk of mortality? C, a problem in the differential diagnosis? Or D, runs a definite and prescribed course? Okay, the answer for this one is A. CPT defines an acute illness with systemic symptoms as an illness that causes systemic symptoms and has a high risk of morbidity without treatment. So the key here is that risk of morbidity. If you don't have that risk, then you're likely looking at a self-limited or minor problem or an acute uncomplicated illness. CPT explicitly says that if you have general symptoms like fever, body aches, or fatigue with a minor illness that may be treated to alleviate those symptoms, refer to the self-limited or acute uncomplicated problems. So a common confusion is assuming any fever, fatigue, etc., is automatically an acute illness with systemic symptoms and therefore moderate complexity. But the systemic symptom, such as a fever, does not automatically give you a problem level, a moderate problem level. For example, if a patient has a sinus infection and a fever, assuming there are no other complications, you more than likely have not met this definition. You have a low problem level because we have a minor or self-limited problem, and we don't have the high risk of morbidity. That's what this distinction in the CPT definition means. CPT had previously given some examples for this category, such as pneumonitis and colitis. So let's say we have a patient with colitis presenting with fever and fatigue. Colitis is not really a minor illness, and it carries a high risk of morbidity. So long as that risk and symptoms are documented, you've met this definition. The CPT definition also includes a note that I think causes some confusion, which says that these symptoms may not be general, but may be a single system. What this means is, even if our colitis patient didn't have a fever, symptoms such as abdominal or rectal pain specific to the GI tract is enough on its own to meet this description. So it can be either a general systemic symptom like a fever, fatigue, body aches, or it can be localized to a single system. All right, our last question Our last question is, a chronic illness that is acutely worsening, poorly controlled, or progressing with an intent to control progression and requiring additional supportive care describes which of the following? Is it A, chronic illness with severe exacerbation, B, chronic illness with exacerbation, C, stable chronic illness, or D, undiagnosed new problem? All right, we're kind of split down the middle on this one. The answer here is B, chronic illness with exacerbation. This is how CPT defines chronic illness with exacerbation, which is a moderate problem level. Now, for chronic illness with severe exacerbation, which is a high problem level, by definition, the severe exacerbation or severe side effects of treatment has a significant risk of morbidity and may require escalation of care. So the exacerbation is severe when it results in a significant risk of morbidity. So let's think about an example. You have a patient with asthma who has a cold and coughing quite a bit, so they're using their inhaler multiple times a day, but they can still speak in full sentences and breathe adequately. You have a chronic illness with exacerbation. But maybe another patient with asthma has a sudden attack, gasping for air, their lips are turning blue, they're unable to speak more than one word at a time, and the rescue inhaler just isn't working. The physician immediately administers a nebulizer treatment. The physician has documented all of this and that the patient is at significant risk for heart failure. This would be a chronic illness with a severe exacerbation. The severity and risk associated with the exacerbation needs to be documented. If the documentation is not clear, you will want to get clarification from the physician or practitioner to help clarify if you have a severe exacerbation. We had another pre-submitted question, which asks, how do you classify conditions if the provider does not document the status, such as stable, controlled, worsening, etc.? The provider needs to document the status of the condition. Coders or auditors are not able to assume whether the condition is stable, controlled, worsening. So we would look for, what are the treatment goals? Is the patient meeting those treatment goals? Those things will need to be documented by the practitioner. All right, here we have some additional resources for evaluation and management services. First is a page on our website with some high-level information on E&M services, and that one's a great place to start if you're new to medical decision-making. Next, we have a page on documentation for an E&M service under TPE review, which includes a few tips about signatures, as well as links to additional CMS resources. And then the last one listed here is the resource that includes CERT Errors for E&M services, which I spoke about earlier in the presentation. All right, we have just a couple minutes to spare, so I will check in with Leanne. Leanne, do we have any unanswered questions in the chat?
Actually, we do not have any unanswered questions in the chat at this time.
All righty, thank you. So if you do think of any additional questions, you have 7 days from today to submit those. You'll send those to our education mailbox and make sure to include the title of this webinar, In-Flight MDM Service, Problems Addressed, Interactive Q&A Activity in the subject line, Or you could just, again, shorten that up to MDM problems addressed or something like that, so that they make sure those emails come to Leanne and I. Please keep in mind that we are not able to access any claims history, so you will want to contact customer service for any claims related questions. In a few minutes, you will receive an email to thank you for attending, and you don't want to delete this one without reading it. The email contains your certificate of achievement. It will have your name and contact hours if you need to turn that in for credit towards continuing education units. If you do not receive the email, a few things may have happened. First, you might want to check your spam or junk folder. Also, be sure to add messenger@webex.com to your safe sender list so that any future messages will show up in your inbox. Also, if you joined by phone only, you would not have received this email, as there's not a way for us to capture your email systematically from the attendance record. No need to worry though. If you did join by phone, you are able to email us with the phone number you joined with to request your certificate of attendance. And Leanne will be adding that email address to the chat. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey. You can tell us what you liked, what we can do better, and suggest topics for future education. You'll have a few different options to take the survey. You can use the link in the chat, or when you exit today, you'll be prompted to go to an external site, and that external site is the CMS Qualtrics page. You'll have a prompt that will look like the picture we have shown here with a little yellow triangle, and we included this image on the top right of this slide so that you know this is safe. It's not malware or anything like that. For those listening through our website or through YouTube, you also have the same opportunity to provide feedback. You will have a survey card at the end of the presentation, and the link is also available in the description. All right, that concludes our webinar. On behalf of myself, Leanne, and all of our provider outreach and education team, we thank you for taking the time to join us, and thank you for your participation in our activity today. We look forward to your survey feedback and hope to see you at future events. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. You may now disconnect.